Mother Bear gathered baby supplies from every ward. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning mist hung thick around Riverside General Hospital like a gray blanket that refused to lift. Inside the quiet corridors, the soft beeping of machines mixed with the distant cry of newborns from the maternity ward. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been working the night shift for 3 years, but something about this particular dawn felt different. The air carried an unusual tension that made her pause at the nurse's station. She glanced at her watch. 6:15 in the morning. Most of the hospital slept peacefully, with only essential staff moving through the dimly lit hallways. Elena had just finished checking on Mrs. Patterson's newborn when she heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from somewhere near the supply closets. Probably just the old heating system, she whispered to herself, but her heart began beating faster. The scratching came again, this time followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. Elena walked slowly toward the sound, her soft-soled shoes making no noise on the polished floor. The supply room door stood slightly open, which was strange because hospital policy required all storage areas to remain locked. Through the crack, she could see shelves lined with baby formula, diapers, and tiny blankets, all the supplies that kept the maternity ward running smoothly. The breathing sound grew louder. Elena's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial security, a massive shadow moved across the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw something that shouldn't exist in a hospital corridor. An enormous bear stood on its hind legs, carefully examining a package of newborn diapers with surprising gentleness. The animal's thick brown fur was matted with morning dew, and its dark eyes held an intelligence that Elena had never seen in any wild creature. But what shocked her most wasn't the bear's presence. It was the way the animal handled the baby supplies. The bear wasn't destroying anything. Instead, it was gathering items with the same careful attention Elena had seen in new mothers preparing for their babies. One massive paw held a container of formula, while the other reached for a soft, yellow blanket. The bear's movements were deliberate, purposeful, almost maternal. Elena pressed herself against the wall, afraid to breathe too loudly. Her medical training told her to call for help immediately, but something deeper made her wait and watch. The bear seemed to be searching for specific items, rejecting some supplies while carefully selecting others. Minutes passed like hours. The bear filled what appeared to be a makeshift sling, made from torn fabric with baby bottles, formula containers, several small blankets, and packages of the softest diapers the hospital stocked. Elena noticed the animal favored the premature baby supplies, the smallest bottles, the gentlest formula, the tiniest clothing. When the bear finished gathering its supplies, it dropped back to all fours and turned toward the door. For one terrifying moment, its eyes met Elena's through the crack in the doorway. But instead of aggression, Elena saw something that made her heart ache. Pure, desperate love mixed with exhaustion that every mother would recognize. The bear moved past her hiding spot without making any threatening gestures. Elena watched as the massive creature padded silently down the corridor, carrying its bundle of baby supplies like precious cargo. The animal seemed to know exactly where it was going, navigating the hospital's maze of hallways with unexpected familiarity. Elena's hands shook as she finally reached for her phone, but she hesitated before dialing. Something about the bear's behavior didn't fit any wildlife emergency she'd been trained for. This wasn't a dangerous animal looking for food or shelter. This was something else entirely. She followed at a safe distance, watching as the bear made its way toward the maternity ward. Her heart pounded with each step, knowing that area housed the hospital's most vulnerable patients. But the bear's movements remained gentle and purposeful, never showing any signs of the aggression everyone expected from wild animals. The corridor stretched ahead of them both, and Elena realized she was about to witness something that would change her understanding of the natural world forever. The bear paused at the entrance to the maternity ward, as if sensing the precious lives beyond those doors, and Elena held her breath, wondering what would happen next in this impossible encounter between wilderness and healing. The bear stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, its massive head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds only it could hear. Elena noticed the animal's ears twitching, picking up the soft murmur of sleeping babies and the gentle hum of medical equipment. The bundle of supplies remained secure in the bear's makeshift sling, protected like a treasure against its chest. Suddenly, the bear's behavior changed. Instead of entering the maternity ward, it turned and headed toward the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor. Elena's confusion deepened as she realized the animal seemed to know the hospital's layout better than most visitors. How was this possible? The bear moved with confidence through areas that even experienced staff sometimes found confusing. As they approached the emergency exit, Elena heard voices coming from the parking lot outside. Her stomach dropped when she recognized the authoritative tones of hospital security mixed with what sounded like animal control officers. Someone else must have spotted the bear and called for help. The situation was about to become dangerous for everyone involved. The bear seemed to sense the approaching threat too. Its pace quickened, and Elena could see tension building in the animal's powerful shoulders. But instead of panic, the bear displayed a calculating intelligence that sent chills down Elena's spine. This creature was thinking, planning, adapting to the changing circumstances with startling awareness. Elena made a decision that would haunt her for weeks to come. Instead of alerting the security team to the bear's exact location, she hung back and continued observing. Something deep in her medical training told her that this situation required understanding, not immediate intervention. The bear's careful selection of baby supplies suggested a purpose that nobody else seemed to recognize. The bear reached the emergency exit and paused again, pressing its massive body against the door as if testing whether it was locked. Elena watched in amazement as the animal seemed to understand the door's mechanism, using its weight to push down on the handle while simultaneously pressing against the frame. The door opened with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. Cool morning air rushed into the hospital, carrying with it the scents of pine trees and damp earth. The bear's entire demeanor changed as it caught these familiar smells. Elena saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about wild animals. The bear's eyes filled with what could only be described as relief mixed with urgent determination. But as the bear prepared to leave the hospital, Elena noticed something that made her heart race with new understanding. Tiny drops of what looked like milk were scattered on the floor behind the animal, creating a trail that led back through the corridors they had just traveled. The bear wasn't just gathering supplies randomly, it was lactating. This was a mother, and somewhere nearby a baby was waiting. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. This mother bear had somehow learned that hospitals contained the supplies needed to care for infants. The animal had risked everything, entering a building full of strange sounds and unfamiliar smells, because something had happened to make normal bear maternal care impossible. Elena's medical mind began racing through possibilities, each scenario more heart-wrenching than the last. The voices outside grew louder, and Elena could hear equipment being moved around. Tranquilizer guns, most likely, along with the heavy cages used to transport dangerous wildlife. The bear heard them too, and for the first time since Elena had been watching, the animal showed signs of fear. Its breathing became rapid and shallow, and the bundle of baby supplies was clutched even more protectively against its chest. Elena found herself stepping forward before she consciously decided to act. "Wait," she whispered so softly that even she barely heard the word. But somehow, the bear turned toward her voice. Their eyes met again, and this time Elena was certain she saw recognition. The bear remembered her from their first encounter at the supply closet. In that moment of connection, Elena noticed details that had escaped her attention before. The bear's fur was matted not just with dew, but with what looked like dried blood around its shoulder area. There were scratches and cuts on its front paws, evidence of desperate digging or climbing. Most telling of all, the bear's mammary area showed signs of recent nursing, but also trauma that Elena's trained eye immediately recognized as injury. The pieces of an incredible story began falling into place in Elena's mind. This mother bear had been injured, possibly in a fight with another predator or in an accident. The injury had made it impossible for her to produce enough milk or provide proper care for her cubs. Driven by maternal instinct stronger than fear, she had somehow discovered that the human world contained resources that could save her babies. The bear took another step toward the exit, but the sounds of approaching humans made it freeze again. Elena could see the animal's internal struggle. Every instinct screamed to flee from the approaching danger, but the bundle of precious supplies represented the difference between life and death for cubs waiting somewhere in the forest. Elena made another impulsive decision that would change everything. She pulled out her cell phone and quickly typed a text message to Jake Morrison, the head of hospital security. Instead of reporting a dangerous bear, she wrote, "Emergency situation developing at East Exit. Need you to quietly delay animal control for 10 minutes. Trust me on this. Lives depend on it." Jake had worked with Elena through countless emergencies over the past 3 years. He trusted her judgment in medical situations, and Elena prayed that trust would extend to this impossible scenario. Her phone buzzed with a quick reply. 10 minutes. This better be good. The bear seemed to sense that something had changed in the dynamics outside. The voices became more distant, and Elena could hear Jake's commanding tone, redirecting the animal control team to check other areas of the hospital first. The bear's tension eased slightly, but it remained alert and ready to bolt at the first sign of direct threat. Elena knew she had bought precious time, but for what? She still didn't understand the full scope of what she was witnessing. The bear clearly needed those baby supplies, but how had it learned they existed here? How had it navigated the hospital's complex layout? And most importantly, where were the cubs that desperately needed the formula and blankets the mother had risked everything to obtain? As if reading her thoughts, the bear did something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. The animal approached her directly, closing the distance between them to less than 6 feet. Elena's training screamed at her to run, but the bear's body language showed no aggression. Instead, the massive creature looked directly into Elena's eyes and made a sound unlike anything she had ever heard from a wild animal. It was a low, rumbling vocalization that somehow conveyed urgency, pleading, and intelligence all at once. The bear was trying to communicate with her, trying to make her understand something that words couldn't express. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized she was witnessing a level of cross-species communication that scientists claimed was impossible. The bear repeated the sound, this time with a subtle change in tone that Elena's musician's ear caught immediately. The animal was modulating its voice, trying different approaches to see if any would trigger understanding in the human facing it. This wasn't just intelligence. This was problem-solving of a sophistication that challenged everything Elena thought she knew about animal cognition. Elena found herself responding instinctively. She dropped to one knee, making herself less threatening while maintaining eye contact with the bear. "I want to help," she whispered, knowing the words were meaningless to the animal but hoping her tone would convey her intentions. "Show me what you need." The bear's reaction was immediate and stunning. It turned toward the exit, took several steps, then looked back at Elena expectantly. The message was clear. It wanted her to follow. Elena's rational mind told her this was insane, that following a wild bear into the forest was suicide. But her heart, the part of her that had chosen medicine because she couldn't bear to see suffering, overruled her survival instincts. She stood up slowly and took a step toward the bear. The animal waited until she was close enough to follow, then pushed through the emergency exit into the gray morning light. Elena hesitated at the threshold, knowing that once she crossed it, there would be no turning back from whatever impossible situation she was about to enter. The cool air hit her face as she stepped outside, and Elena realized she was about to embark on a journey that would test everything she believed about the boundaries between human and animal worlds. The bear was already moving toward the tree line, carrying its precious bundle of baby supplies, and Elena knew that somewhere in those woods lay answers to questions she had never thought to ask. The forest behind Riverside General Hospital stretched for miles into the Cascade Mountains, an ancient wilderness that most hospital staff never bothered to explore. Elena had always admired the view from her office window, but she had never imagined she would be following a wild bear into its depths. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the entire situation feel like a dream. The bear moved with surprising speed despite its injured condition, following what appeared to be a well-worn path through the underbrush. Elena struggled to keep up, her hospital shoes slipping on the damp earth and catching on fallen branches. But every time she fell behind, the bear would pause and wait, looking back at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding she couldn't fathom. As they climbed higher into the forest, Elena began to notice disturbing signs that told a story of recent violence. Deep claw marks scored the bark of several trees, far too high for any normal forest animal to have made. Patches of brown fur clung to thorny bushes, and dark stains on the ground suggested blood had been spilled in significant quantities. Whatever had happened here had been brutal and recent. The bear's pace slowed as they approached a clearing where the signs of conflict became even more pronounced. Elena's medical training kicked in as she surveyed what looked like a battlefield. The earth was torn up as if by massive claws, and several saplings had been snapped in half by tremendous force. But most disturbing of all were the tracks pressed deep into the soft soil. Bear prints, but far larger than those of the animal she was following. "My God," Elena whispered, beginning to understand what had happened. The mother bear had been attacked by a much larger male, probably defending her cubs from infanticide. Male bears were known to kill cubs that weren't their own, forcing females to mate again sooner. This mother had fought desperately to protect her babies, sustaining injuries that now prevented her from producing enough milk to keep them alive. The bear heard Elena's voice and turned back to her, making that same complex vocalization she had heard in the hospital. But this time, the sound carried notes of grief and desperation that made Elena's heart break. The animal was telling her story in the only way it could, sharing the trauma that had driven it to risk everything for supplies it couldn't possibly understand, but somehow knew might save its young. Elena found herself responding without thinking. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying the same tone she used with grieving families in the hospital. I'm so sorry this happened to you." The bear's ears perked up at the compassionate tone, and for a moment Elena swore she saw gratitude in those dark eyes. They continued deeper into the forest, and Elena began to notice something that made her question her own sanity. The path they were following wasn't random, it was deliberately constructed. Someone or something had moved fallen logs to create steps up steep inclines, had cleared away thorny bushes to make passage easier, and had even arranged stones to provide stable footing across a small stream. The construction was crude but effective, clearly the work of an intelligence that understood basic engineering principles. Elena's mind reeled as she realized what this meant. The bear hadn't just stumbled upon the hospital by accident. It had been planning this mission, preparing a route that would allow it to carry precious cargo safely back to its cubs. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As they crested a small hill, Elena saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Ahead of them, nestled in a natural depression between two massive boulders, was what could only be described as a constructed shelter. Branches had been woven together to create walls, large leaves had been arranged to form a waterproof roof, and soft moss had been gathered to create a comfortable floor. The engineering was sophisticated, showing an understanding of structural principles that challenged everything Elena thought she knew about animal intelligence. But what made her heart race was the realization that this wasn't just a shelter. It was a nursery, built with the same loving care that human parents put into preparing for their children. The mother bear approached the shelter with visible excitement, making soft chuffing sounds that Elena recognized as calls to cubs. But as they got closer, Elena heard something that made her blood run cold: the weak, desperate cries of baby animals in distress. The cubs were alive, but barely, and their vocalizations spoke of hunger and suffering that the mother's injuries had made impossible to relieve. Elena watched as the bear carefully opened the bundle of hospital supplies she had carried so far. The animal's paws, which had seemed so clumsy in the hospital corridors, now moved with precise delicacy as they sorted through the bottles, formula, and blankets. But as Elena observed this incredible display of maternal organization, she realized something that changed everything she thought she understood about the situation. The bear was trying to use the baby bottles, but its paws couldn't manipulate the small nipples and caps. The formula containers were sealed with child-proof mechanisms that required opposing thumb movements the bear couldn't perform. The blankets were soft and warm, but the bear couldn't figure out how to properly swaddle cubs that were too weak to maintain their own body temperature. The mother bear had risked everything to obtain supplies that could save her cubs, but she lacked the physical ability to use them effectively. Elena watched in heartbreak as the desperate animal tried again and again to operate a baby bottle, growing more frustrated and panicked with each failed attempt. The cubs' cries were getting weaker, and Elena realized she was witnessing a tragedy that would haunt her forever if she didn't act. But before she could step forward to help, she heard something that made her freeze in terror. Heavy footsteps were approaching through the forest, accompanied by human voices and the metallic sounds of equipment being moved. The delayed animal control team had finally tracked them down, and they were bringing enough firepower to handle what they believed was a dangerous bear threatening human life. The mother bear heard them too, and its behavior changed instantly. The animal positioned itself between the approaching sounds and the shelter containing its cubs, growing low in its throat with a sound that promised violence to anyone who threatened its young. Elena could see the internal struggle tearing the bear apart. Every instinct screamed to flee from the approaching humans, but maternal love made abandoning the cubs impossible. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. She could call out to the animal control team, try to explain what was really happening, But would they believe her incredible story? Would they give her time to demonstrate the bear's intelligence and need, or would they see only a wild animal that had lured a hospital worker into danger? The voices were getting closer, and Elena could make out individual words now. "Tracks lead this way," someone was saying. "Big female, probably rabid to be acting this strange. We'll need to put her down immediately." The casual discussion of ending this remarkable animal's life made Elena's medical oath surge within her. First, do no harm. She made a decision that would either save a family or cost her everything. Instead of calling out to warn the approaching team, Elena moved quickly to the bundle of baby supplies. Her hands shook as she grabbed a bottle and began preparing formula, using skills she had learned during her pediatric rotation years ago. The mother bear watched in amazement as Elena demonstrated how to attach the nipple, how to test the temperature, and how to hold the bottle at the correct angle. Elena's movements were quick and efficient, driven by the approaching sounds of the search team and the weakening cries of the cubs that needed immediate help. "Please," Elena whispered to the bear, holding out the prepared bottle. "Let me help them." The mother bear stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the internal struggle playing out in those intelligent eyes. Every survival instinct told the animal to distrust humans, but the cub's desperate needs overrode millions of years of evolutionary caution. The bear stepped aside, allowing Elena to approach the shelter. What she saw inside made her gasp with shock and wonder. 3 tiny cubs, no more than a few weeks old, lay nestled in a bed of the softest moss and leaves. But these weren't ordinary bear cubs. Their fur patterns were unlike anything Elena had seen in wildlife documentaries, and their eyes held the same startling intelligence she had recognized in their mother. One of the cubs was clearly weaker than the others, its breathing shallow and labored. Elena's medical training took over as she gently lifted the tiny animal and began feeding it formula from the bottle. The cub latched onto the nipple with desperate hunger, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized she was literally saving a life that conventional wisdom said she should fear. The mother bear watched every movement Elena made with intense concentration, learning how to hold the bottles, how to support the cubs' heads, how to burp them after feeding. The animal's ability to observe and learn was extraordinary, demonstrating cognitive abilities that would revolutionize understanding of wildlife intelligence if the scientific community ever learned about it. But their time was running out. The voices of the search team were getting closer, and Elena could hear dogs barking in the distance. Soon, this peaceful clearing would be invaded by well-meaning humans who would see only a dangerous situation that needed to be ended with tranquilizer darts and cages. Elena looked into the mother bear's eyes one more time, seeing a depth of gratitude and understanding that transcended species boundaries. "I have to go back," she whispered, "but I promise I'll find a way to help you." The bear nodded, in a gesture that nearly made Elena collapse with the implications of what she was witnessing. As Elena prepared to leave the clearing, the weakest cub she had just fed made a soft sound that stopped her in her tracks. The tiny animal was looking directly at her with eyes that seemed far too aware for such a young creature. In that moment, Elena realized she wasn't just walking away from a remarkable wildlife encounter. She was leaving behind a family that had trusted her with their lives. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Elena knew she had to make a choice that would define the rest of her career and possibly her life. She could lead the search team away from the clearing, protecting this incredible family while risking her own credibility and safety. Or she could reveal the location and hope that somehow the authorities would see what she had seen and make decisions based on wonder rather than fear. The mother bear seemed to understand her dilemma. The animal approached Elena one final time, and did something that would haunt her dreams forever. It gently touched her hand with one massive paw, a gesture of gratitude and farewell that conveyed more emotion than any human words could express. Elena turned and began walking back toward the approaching voices, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Behind her, she could hear the soft sounds of the mother bear settling in to feed her cubs with the bottles Elena had prepared, using techniques she had learned by watching human compassion in action. But as Elena reached the edge of the clearing, she heard something that made her blood run cold. One of the search team members was speaking into a radio, and his words carried clearly through the morning air. "We've got reports of unusual bear activity in this area for the past month. Multiple sightings of animals showing abnormal intelligence. Command wants us to bring in any bears we find for scientific study." Elena realized that the remarkable family she had just left wasn't unique. There were others like them, and someone in authority already knew about their existence. The mother bear's desperate mission to save her cubs was just one story in a larger mystery that stretched far beyond a single hospital raid. As she prepared to face the search team and somehow protect the secret she had just discovered, Elena knew her life had just taken a turn that would lead her into discoveries that would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about the natural world. Elena forced herself to walk calmly toward the approaching voices, even though every fiber of her being screamed to run back and protect the bear family she had just left. Her mind worked frantically to construct a believable story that would lead the search team away from the clearing while maintaining her credibility as a medical professional. The weight of what she had witnessed pressed down on her like a physical burden. She was now the keeper of a secret that could change the world. The first person she encountered was Marcus Webb, the lead animal control officer for the county. Elena had met him before during previous wildlife incidents at the hospital, and she knew him to be thorough, professional, and unfortunately completely inflexible when it came to following protocol. His weathered face showed concern when he spotted her emerging from the forest alone. "Doctor Vasquez, what are you doing out here?" Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We received reports that you followed a dangerous animal into these woods. Are you injured?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the fate of the remarkable family, hidden just a few hundred yards away. "I'm fine, Marcus. The bear headed north about 20 minutes ago, toward the old logging road. It seemed disoriented, possibly sick. I tried to track it to assess its condition, but I lost the trail near the creek." The lie came easier than Elena had expected, and she hated herself for how naturally deception seemed to flow when lives were at stake. But as she spoke, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Marcus wasn't looking at her. He was studying the ground around her feet with the keen eyes of someone trained to read tracks and signs. "Interesting," Marcus said slowly, crouching down to examine the soft earth. "Because these tracks tell a different story. Fresh bear prints heading east, not north, and they're accompanied by human footprints that match your shoes exactly." He stood up and fixed Elena with a stare that told her he knew she was lying. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there." Elena's heart raced as she realized her deception had been exposed within minutes. Marcus's reputation for tracking skills was legendary in the county, and she had been foolish to think she could mislead someone who could read the forest like a book. But before she could formulate another response, the radio on Marcus's belt crackled to life with a voice that made Elena's blood freeze. "Control to Field Team Alpha. Be advised that Dr. Sarah Chen from the Federal Wildlife Research Division is en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. All team members are to maintain current positions and avoid contact with any anomalous subjects until Dr. Chen arrives on scene." The word anomalous hung in the air like a threat. Elena watched Marcus's expression change from routine enforcement to something approaching excitement mixed with apprehension. He keyed his radio and responded in a voice that carried new urgency. "Copy control. Field Team Alpha will maintain perimeter until Dr. Chen's arrival. Request clarification on anomalous subjects designation." The response came immediately, and the words chilled Elena to the bone. "Dr. Chen is leading the federal investigation into reports of unusual cognitive behavior in local wildlife populations. Any bears exhibiting problem-solving abilities, tool use, or complex social structures are to be considered priority subjects for research purposes." Elena felt the world tilt around her as the implications became clear. The federal government wasn't just aware of bears like the mother she had just helped, they were actively hunting them. The term research purposes sounded clinical and benign, but Elena's medical background gave her insight into what federal research on unusual animals typically involved. Invasive procedures, behavioral testing, isolation from natural habitat, and ultimately dissection to understand the source of their enhanced abilities. Marcus noticed Elena's pale complexion and assumed it was shock from her encounter with a wild animal. "Don't worry, Doctor. Vasquez. Dr. Chen specializes in cases like this. If there's something unusual about the bear you encountered, she'll know how to handle it safely." Elena wanted to scream that safety wasn't the issue. The bear family she had just left needed protection, not federal intervention. But she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that any emotional outburst would only increase suspicion about her involvement. "What kind of unusual behavior are we talking about?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice casual while gathering intelligence that might help her protect the bears. Marcus glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, we've had reports over the past 6 months of bears exhibiting behavior that defies normal wildlife patterns. They're using tools, constructing elaborate shelters, and displaying coordination that suggests advanced communication abilities." He paused, studying Elena's reaction before continuing. "Last month, a bear was observed dismantling a fence by systematically removing bolts in a specific sequence that would cause the least structural damage. 2 weeks ago, another bear was caught on trail cameras teaching its cubs to use sticks to extract honey from artificial hives in a way that required understanding of leverage and angles." Elena's mind reeled as she realized the scope of what was happening. The mother bear she had helped wasn't an isolated case. There was an entire population of extraordinarily intelligent bears living in these mountains, and their secret was already known to authorities who viewed them as subjects for study rather than sentient beings deserving protection. "The strangest case," Marcus continued, "was a bear that apparently learned to mimic human vocalizations. A camping family reported having what they described as a conversation with a bear that repeated their words back to them with appropriate emotional inflection. They said it felt like talking to someone who understood language but couldn't quite speak it properly." Elena's knees nearly buckled as she remembered the complex vocalizations the mother bear had used to communicate with her. The animal hadn't just been making random sounds. It had been attempting actual communication, modulating its voice to convey specific meanings and emotions. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted her thoughts. Through the trees, Elena could see black SUVs pulling up to the hospital parking lot, their government plates glinting in the morning sun. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived, and with her came resources that would make hiding the bear family impossible. Elena watched as a small army of people emerged from the vehicles. Some wore the standard uniforms of wildlife officers, but others were dressed in the kind of tactical gear usually reserved for military operations. They carried equipment she didn't recognize: devices that looked like sophisticated tracking tools, portable laboratory equipment, and what appeared to be specialized tranquilizer systems designed for large animals. But what terrified Elena most was the convoy of transport vehicles that followed the SUVs. These weren't the standard cages used by animal control. They were climate-controlled research transport units, designed to keep subjects alive and healthy during extended periods of captivity. Someone was planning to take any bears they found to a facility where they would spend the rest of their lives as research subjects. Marcus's radio crackled again, and this time the voice belonged to someone with clear authority over the entire operation. "All units, Dr. Chen has arrived. Establish a perimeter around the target area and begin systematic grid search. Priority is capture, not elimination. Repeat, these subjects are to be taken alive and unharmed." Elena realized she had perhaps 10 minutes before the search grid reached the clearing where the bear family was hidden. 10 minutes to somehow warn them or lead the search away. But even as she considered her options, she knew the futility of her situation. Professional trackers with sophisticated equipment wouldn't be fooled by false trails or misdirection. The bear's only hope was to flee deeper into the mountains, but the mother's injuries and the cub's weakness made rapid travel impossible. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "I know this is overwhelming, but Dr. Chen really is one of the good ones. Her research has helped protect wildlife populations across the country. If these bears really are as special as the reports suggest, she'll make sure they're studied properly and ethically." Elena wanted to believe him, but her medical training had taught her to be skeptical of research that prioritized scientific advancement over individual welfare. She had seen too many cases where the phrase, "for the greater good," had been used to justify causing suffering to individual subjects, whether human or animal. A new voice interrupted her thoughts, clear, professional, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the forest, having approached from a different direction while Elena was talking to Marcus. She was younger than Elena had expected, probably in her early 40s, with a lean build of someone who spent significant time in the field. "Dr. Vasquez, I presume?" Dr. Chen extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine, but didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Federal Wildlife Research Division. I understand you had quite an encounter this morning." Elena shook the offered hand, noticing that Dr. Chen's grip was firm, and her eyes sharp with intelligence. This wasn't someone who could be easily deceived or distracted from her mission. Elena realized she was facing an opponent whose dedication to her work might be every bit as strong as Elena's desire to protect the bear family. "It was unusual," Elena admitted carefully. "The bear seemed more aware than I would have expected from a wild animal." Dr. Chen's eyes lit up with interest. "Aware in what way? I'd like you to describe your encounter in as much detail as possible. Even small observations could be crucial to our research." Elena found herself in an impossible position. Providing accurate details might help Dr. Chen locate the bear family faster, but being too vague would raise suspicions about her motives. She decided on a strategy of selective truth, sharing some observations while withholding the most crucial information. "The bear seemed to be gathering specific items rather than just scavenging randomly," Elena said. "It showed what appeared to be planning and purpose in its selection process." Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. "That's consistent with other reports we've received. Did you observe any tool use or problem-solving behavior?" Elena hesitated, remembering the sophisticated way the bear had manipulated the hospital door and sorted through the baby supplies. "It seemed to understand how the door mechanism worked," she said finally. "Excellent!" Dr. Chen's excitement was palpable. These behavioral adaptations represent a significant evolutionary development. Understanding their cognitive capabilities could revolutionize our approach to wildlife conservation. But Elena noticed something in Dr. Chen's tone that chilled her. The researcher spoke about the bears as if they were fascinating puzzles to be solved rather than sentient beings with their own rights and needs. Elena had heard the same tone from medical researchers who viewed patients as collections of symptoms rather than individual people deserving compassion. Dr. Chen turned to Marcus and began issuing rapid orders. I want tracking teams in a standard grid pattern, but move slowly and quietly. These animals have demonstrated enhanced awareness, so they may detect our approach from greater distances than normal bears. Use the long-range tranquilizers if you get a clear shot, but remember, I need them alive and unharmed. Elena watched the search team spread out through the forest with military precision. Each team carried radio equipment, GPS units, and those specialized tranquilizer systems she had noticed earlier. But what worried her most were the portable cages they dragged behind them, devices clearly designed to contain large animals for extended periods. As the teams disappeared into the forest, Elena realized she was out of time and options. The professional search would reach the clearing within minutes, and there was nothing she could do to prevent the capture of the remarkable family she had sworn to protect. The mother bear's trust in her had been misplaced. Elena had failed to find a way to help them escape the fate that awaited all extraordinary beings in a world that valued knowledge over compassion. But just as despair began to overwhelm her, Elena heard something that changed everything. From deep in the forest came a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, a complex vocalization that seemed to carry across miles of woodland with perfect clarity. It wasn't the voice of one bear, but many, calling to each other in what could only be described as language. Dr. Chen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and excitement. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "That's not random vocalization. That's structured communication. We're not dealing with isolated individuals showing enhanced intelligence. We're looking at an entire population that has developed its own language system." Elena's heart sank as she realized the implications. The mother bear's desperate raid on the hospital had been just the beginning. Hidden in these mountains was an entire community of extraordinarily intelligent bears, and their secret was about to be exposed to a world that would see them as either threats to be contained or the specimens to be studied. The vocalizations continued, growing more complex and urgent, and Elena realized she was listening to a conversation that was deciding the fate of every enhanced bear in the forest. Somewhere in those coordinated calls was a plan being formed, strategies being shared, and perhaps hope for survival that didn't depend on human mercy. Dr. Chen was already calling for additional backup, her voice carrying the excitement of someone on the verge of a discovery that would define her career. But as Elena listened to the sophisticated communication echoing through the forest, she realized that the bear's intelligence might be the very thing that saved them. The hunt was about to begin, but for the first time since this impossible day started, Elena wondered if the prey might be smarter than the predators. The complex vocalizations from the forest suddenly ceased, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to press down on everyone in the search party. Dr. Chen raised her hand, signaling for complete quiet, as she strained to listen for any continuation of the remarkable communication they had just witnessed. Elena could see the wheels turning in the researcher's mind, calculating the implications of what they had heard. "That wasn't random animal noise," Dr. Chen whispered to Marcus, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "That was coordinated communication across multiple groups. We're not dealing with a few isolated animals showing enhanced intelligence. We're looking at a structured society. Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized the full scope of what Dr. Chen was suggesting. If the bears had developed their own language and social structure, they weren't just unusual animals anymore. They were a species showing signs of genuine civilization. And in Elena's experience, human responses to non-human intelligence had historically been far from compassionate. Marcus was already adjusting his equipment, switching his radio to a frequency that would allow him to coordinate with teams spread across several square miles of forest. Should we proceed with the capture protocol, or do we need to reassess our approach? Dr. Chen's response chilled Elena to the bone. We proceed, but with enhanced caution. If these animals are capable of complex communication, they're also capable of complex planning. They may have anticipated our arrival and developed countermeasures. The word countermeasures hung in the air like a threat. Elena realized that Dr. Chen was now viewing the bears not as research subjects, but as potential adversaries in an intellectual conflict. The scientists' excitement about the discovery was being rapidly overshadowed by the challenge of capturing beings whose intelligence might rival their own. As if summoned by Dr. Chen's concerns, a new sound emerged from the forest. But this time it came from directly behind them. Elena spun around to see movement in the trees near the hospital parking lot, and her heart nearly stopped when she realized what she was looking at. 3 enormous bears had positioned themselves between the research team and their vehicles, effectively cutting off the humans' primary escape route. But these weren't random animals. Their positioning was clearly strategic, and they moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Elena could see intelligence burning in their eyes as they assessed the human threat with calculating awareness. "Nobody move," Dr. Chen commanded, her scientific excitement now completely replaced by survival instinct. These are not normal bear behaviors. They're demonstrating tactical thinking. Elena watched in amazement as the bears began what could only be described as a coordinated communication sequence. The largest bear, a massive male with distinctive silver markings on his chest, made a series of low vocalizations that were immediately answered by the other 2. But the responses weren't simple repetitions. They were variations that suggested complex information was being exchanged. Marcus had his tranquilizer gun ready, but Dr. Chen gestured for him to hold fire. "Wait," she whispered. "I want to observe their behavior patterns. This could be the breakthrough discovery of the century." But Elena was noticing details that the others missed. The bears weren't just communicating with each other. They were studying the humans with the same intensity that the research team was studying them. The largest male kept glancing toward the forest where Elena knew the mother bear and her cubs were hiding, and Elena realized with growing amazement that this was a rescue operation. The bears had somehow learned about the government hunt and had mobilized to protect their vulnerable family members. Elena found herself witnessing the first documented case of wild animals organizing a deliberate defensive action against human threats. The implications were staggering. These creatures weren't just intelligent. They had developed military-style tactical thinking. Dr. Chen was frantically making notes on a waterproof tablet, her scientific training overriding her survival instincts even in this dangerous situation. "This is unprecedented," she muttered. "Coordinated defensive positioning, strategic communication, threat assessment capabilities. We're looking at cognitive abilities that rival human military planning." But as Elena watched the standoff develop, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The bears weren't just defensive, they were angry. The intelligence burning in their eyes was accompanied by something that looked very much like righteous fury. They knew exactly why the humans were there, and they didn't approve. The largest male took a step forward, and Elena heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath as the man realized his tranquilizer gun might not be sufficient to stop an animal of that size if it decided to charge. But the bear didn't attack. Instead, it did something that made Elena question everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. The bear looked directly at Dr. Chen and made a vocalization that was clearly directed at her specifically. The sound was complex, modulated, and carried emotional undertones that were unmistakably communicative. Elena could hear question marks in the bear's voice, as if it were asking Dr. Chen to explain her intentions. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she realized what was happening. "It's trying to communicate with me directly," she whispered. "It recognizes me as the leader of this group and wants to establish contact." Elena watched as Dr. Chen made a decision that would either be remembered as a breakthrough in interspecies communication or as the last mistake of her career. The scientist took a slow step forward and spoke directly to the bear in a calm, clear voice. "We're here to study and understand, Doctor," Chen said, her words carrying across the tense silence. "We don't want to hurt anyone." The bear's response was immediate and shocking. It shook its massive head in what was clearly a gesture of denial, then pointed with one enormous paw toward the forest where the search teams had disappeared. The message was unmistakable. The bear didn't believe Dr. Chen's claims about peaceful intentions. Elena found herself stepping forward before she could stop herself. "They know about the capture equipment," she said, her voice shaking with the implications. "They've been watching the operation and they understand what the cages and tranquilizer guns mean." Dr. Chen spun to face Elena, her eyes wide with realization. How could you possibly know that? Elena knew she had reached the point where continued deception was impossible. The bear's intelligence had already exposed the true nature of the government operation, and her attempts to protect them by misdirecting the search had failed. She made a decision that would change her life forever. "Because I've already met them," Elena said, her voice gaining strength as she chose honesty over safety. "I've seen their shelters, watched them care for their young, and witnessed intelligence that makes them people, not animals. And I won't stand by while you turn them into research subjects." The admission sent shockwaves through the research team. Marcus stared at Elena in disbelief, while Dr. Chen's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching betrayal. But the bear's reaction was the most telling. The largest male made a sound that Elena could only interpret as approval. "Dr. Vasquez," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying new authority, "you are now interfering with a federal investigation. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from this situation." But before Elena could respond, the forest around them exploded into coordinated activity. Bears emerged from concealment positions that had been invisible moments before, demonstrating a level of camouflage and strategic positioning that would have impressed military tacticians. Elena counted at least 8 adults, all moving with purpose toward predetermined positions. "They had us surrounded the entire time," Marcus breathed, his professional respect for the bear's tactical abilities clear in his voice. "We walked right into a perfectly planned ambush." But Elena realized this wasn't an ambush designed for attack. It was a demonstration of power meant to establish the terms of engagement. The bears had allowed the humans to enter their territory, had listened to their plans, and had responded with a show of force that proved they were capable of defending themselves if necessary. The largest male bear approached Dr. Chen again, this time carrying something that made Elena gasp with amazement. Clutched delicately in the animal's massive jaws was a small electronic device, one of the GPS tracking units that the research teams used to mark their positions in the forest. The bear set the device down at Dr. Chen's feet with obvious intention, then stepped back and waited. The message was clear. They had been monitoring the human technology, understanding its purpose, and were now returning it as a gesture that could be interpreted as either diplomatic or threatening. Dr. Chen stared at the GPS unit in shock. "They've been tracking our tracking equipment," she whispered. "They understand electronic surveillance, and they figured out how to monitor our monitoring." Elena watched as the full implications of the situation dawned on everyone present. These weren't just intelligent animals. They were technologically aware beings capable of understanding and countering human advantages. The balance of power in this encounter was far more even than anyone had expected. From the forest came another series of complex vocalizations, and Elena realized she was listening to real-time strategic communication. The bears were updating each other on the positions of the human search teams, coordinating responses to changing tactical situations, and making decisions about how to proceed. But the most remarkable development came when the largest male bear turned to Elena and made a sound that she immediately recognized. It was the same complex vocalization the mother bear had used in the hospital. A request for communication, a plea for understanding. Elena looked into the bear's eyes and saw not just intelligence but wisdom. This creature understood that she was different from the others, that she had chosen to help rather than exploit. The bear was offering her a chance to serve as an intermediary between two species that were rapidly approaching a conflict neither side could afford. "They want to negotiate," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder at the implications. "They're offering to establish diplomatic contact." Dr. Chen's expression shifted rapidly through surprise, excitement, and calculation. Elena could see the researcher weighing the scientific value of documented interspecies communication against the complications such contact would create for her capture mission. "This changes everything," Dr. Chen said finally. "If they're capable of genuine communication, we can't treat them as ordinary research subjects. We may be looking at the first confirmed case of non-human intelligence capable of formal diplomatic contact." But even as Dr. Chen spoke, Elena could see the conflict in the scientist's eyes. The opportunity to study such remarkable beings was everything a researcher could dream of, but actually communicating with them raised ethical questions that human science wasn't prepared to answer. The standoff continued, with both species assessing each other's capabilities and intentions. Elena found herself at the center of a moment that could define the future relationship between humans and the extraordinary community of bears that had chosen to reveal themselves. But as she looked around at the carefully positioned bears, the sophisticated equipment carried by the research team, and the knowledge that an injured mother and her vulnerable cubs were still hidden somewhere in the forest, depending on the outcome of this encounter, Elena realized that the real test was just beginning. The bears had proven they could outthink and outmaneuver their would-be captors. Now, the question was whether two intelligent species could find a way to coexist, or whether fear and misunderstanding would lead to a conflict that would end in tragedy for everyone involved. The largest male bear made one more vocalization, this one directed at Elena with unmistakable urgency. Elena didn't need to understand the language to recognize a warning when she heard one. Something was about to happen that would force everyone present to choose sides in a confrontation between species that neither was fully prepared to handle. Elena was about to ask what the bear was trying to tell her when the answer arrived with devastating clarity. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the morning air, growing louder by the second. Elena looked up to see 3 military-style aircraft approaching from the south, their black holes gleaming in the sunlight. These weren't the standard wildlife management helicopters she might have expected. These were serious military hardware, complete with external equipment pods and what looked suspiciously like weapons systems. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she grabbed her radio. "Control, this is Dr. Chen. I did not authorize helicopter deployment. What is the nature of this air support?" The response crackled through with military precision that chilled Elena to the bone. "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Hayes, Department of Defense Wildlife Security Division. We are implementing Protocol 7 based on your reports of organized resistance. All ground personnel are to maintain position while we establish aerial superiority." Elena watched in horror as the implications became clear. The government hadn't sent Dr. Chen to study the bears. They had sent her to assess the threat level. The moment her reports confirmed that the bears possessed military-level tactical intelligence, a completely different protocol had been activated. The bears' reaction was immediate and coordinated. The largest male let out a complex vocalization that Elena now recognized as a command structure, and every bear in the area responded with precision that would have impressed elite military units. They didn't flee in panic. Instead, they moved to predetermined positions that suggested they had been planning for exactly this scenario. "They knew this was coming," Elena whispered, amazement and terror warring in her voice. "They've been preparing for military escalation." Dr. Chen spun to face her, eyes wide with realization. "What do you mean they knew? How could they possibly have anticipated military involvement?" Elena's mind raced as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. The mother bear that raided the hospital. She wasn't just gathering supplies for her cubs. She was gathering intelligence. She saw the security cameras, the communication systems, the coordination between different departments. She was learning how human emergency response works. Marcus lowered his tranquilizer gun as he grasped the full scope of what they were facing. "You're saying they've been studying us as much as we've been studying them?" Before Elena could answer, the largest male bear did something that made everyone present question their understanding of the natural world. The massive animal reached into what Elena had assumed was natural fur, and withdrew what was clearly a human-made object, a military-grade radio, modified with what looked like custom adaptations for non-human use. The bear activated the radio with surprising dexterity, and spoke into it with a voice that, while clearly not human, was unmistakably intelligent and purposeful. The words were in a language Elena didn't recognize, but the cadence and structure were clearly communicative. Elena realized she was witnessing the first documented case of a non-human species using human technology for their own communication network. Dr. Chen's scientific training warred with her survival instincts as she watched this impossible scene unfold. "They've modified our own technology," she breathed. "They're not just intelligent, they're engineers." The radio exchange between the bear and unknown parties lasted for nearly a minute, with responses coming from multiple sources. Elena could hear the complexity of the conversation, the give and take of strategic planning, and the unmistakable authority in the large male's voice. This wasn't just an animal using a tool. This was a military commander coordinating with distributed forces. When the radio conversation ended, the bear turned to Dr. Chen and spoke directly to her in English. The words were heavily accented and obviously difficult for the bear's vocal structure to produce, but they were unmistakably clear. "Your leaders break promises. We defend families." The shock of hearing a bear speak human language nearly knocked Elena off her feet. Dr. Chen stumbled backward, her scientific worldview crumbling as she faced undeniable proof that the bears had not only developed their own intelligence, but had been learning human language and monitoring human communications. "How long?" Dr. Chen whispered. "How long have you been watching us?" The bear's response was chilling in its implications. "Since your people came to mountains, we learn your ways to protect ours. Elena realized they were looking at the result of decades of covert observation and learning. The bears hadn't suddenly developed intelligence. They had been intelligent all along, carefully hiding their abilities while studying the human threat and preparing for the day when concealment would no longer be possible. The helicopter formation was circling now, and Elena could see armed personnel preparing to deploy from each aircraft. But as she watched the sky, she noticed something that made her gasp in amazement. The helicopters weren't alone. Large birds were rising from the forest in coordinated formations, moving with purpose that suggested they weren't just fleeing the noise. "Are those eagles working with the bears?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The large male bear seemed almost amused by the question. "We are not alone," he said, his English improving with each word as if he was remembering lessons learned long ago. "Forest has many minds, many allies." Elena watched in wonder as the birds began executing what could only be described as aerial maneuvers, designed to interfere with the helicopter's operations. They weren't attacking the aircraft directly, but they were creating visual obstacles and forcing the pilots to alter their approach patterns. Elena realized she was witnessing the first documented case of interspecies military cooperation in the natural world. Dr. Chen was frantically documenting everything on her tablet, her scientific excitement overriding her fear. "This changes everything we know about animal intelligence and cooperation," she said. "We're not dealing with one species showing enhanced cognition. We're looking at an entire ecosystem that has developed collaborative intelligence." But Elena noticed something that Dr. Chen missed in her excitement. The bear's expression when he looked at the helicopters wasn't just defensive, it was sad. Elena could see grief in those intelligent eyes, the pain of a being who had hoped for peaceful coexistence but was being forced into conflict by human fear and aggression. "You didn't want this fight," Elena said softly to the bear. "You just wanted to be left alone." The bear's response nearly broke Elena's heart. "We wanted to learn from you, to share wisdom. But your leaders fear what they do not control." Elena realized she was witnessing a tragedy that could have been avoided if human had approached the situation with curiosity rather than fear. The bears had intelligence that could have revolutionized understanding of consciousness and cooperation. But human military responses were turning first contact into first conflict. Dr. Chen's radio crackled with new urgency. "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Hayes. We have visual confirmation of coordinated resistance involving multiple species. We are escalating to full containment protocol. All ground personnel are to evacuate to minimum safe distance immediately." Elena felt her stomach drop as she realized what full containment protocol meant. The military wasn't planning to capture the bears for study. They were planning to eliminate them as a potential threat to human security. Elena watched as the bear's expression shifted from sadness to grim determination. He had understood the radio transmission as clearly as she had. The bear spoke into his modified radio again, this time with urgent authority. Elena couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the gravity in his voice as he issued what sounded like final orders to forces she couldn't see. Elena realized that whatever the bears had been planning as a defensive strategy was about to be implemented. "Dr. Chen," Elena said urgently, "you have to stop this. These beings are offering to communicate with us. They're not a threat. They're trying to survive." Dr. Chen looked torn between her scientific ethics and her government orders. "Elena, I understand your feelings, but I don't have authority over military decisions. Colonel Hayes is acting on protocols that are above my clearance level." Elena turned to the large male bear, desperation driving her to attempt direct communication. "Is there anything you can do to show them you're not a threat? Some way to demonstrate that you want peace?" The bear's response chilled her with its resigned wisdom. "Peace requires two sides willing to trust. Your leaders have chosen fear." As if summoned by his words, the sound of the helicopters changed pitch as they began their final approach. Elena could see repelling equipment being prepared and realized that armed soldiers would be on the ground within minutes. The bears around the clearing responded to signals from their leader, moving with coordinated precision toward positions that would give them the best tactical advantage in the coming confrontation. But Elena noticed something else. Several of the bears were moving not toward defensive positions but toward the forest, where she knew the mother bear and her cubs were still hidden. Elena realized that while the large male and his forces prepared to hold off the military attack, other bears were implementing an evacuation plan for the most vulnerable members of their community. "They're protecting their families first," Elena said with growing admiration for the bears' prioritization of innocent lives over tactical advantage. Even facing military attack, they're putting their children's safety above their own. Dr. Chen watched the coordinated evacuation with scientific fascination. The level of social organization is remarkable. They're demonstrating altruistic behavior, long-term planning, and tactical sacrifice, all indicators of advanced moral reasoning. But Elena knew that scientific appreciation wouldn't save the bears from the military forces now deploying around them. She made a decision that would either be remembered as heroic or treasonous, depending on who wrote the history of this remarkable day. Elena stepped between the approaching soldiers and the bear commander, raising her hands in a gesture that she hoped would be recognized as a request for parley. "Colonel Hayes," she called out, knowing her voice would be picked up by the communication equipment the soldiers carried. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez from Riverside General Hospital. I'm requesting a medical consultation before any action is taken." The response came through the soldiers' external speakers. "Dr. Vasquez, you are in a designated danger zone. Evacuate immediately or face arrest for interfering with military operations." Elena stood her ground, looking directly at the bear commander. "I'm invoking my medical authority to declare this a humanitarian situation. These beings are showing signs of advanced intelligence and are attempting to communicate. Any action taken without proper assessment would be a violation of medical ethics and possibly international law." Elena knew she was stretching her authority beyond any reasonable interpretation, but she hoped the reference to international law would give the military pause. If the bears were truly intelligent, then attacking them might constitute crimes that no one was prepared to justify in international courts. The bear commander seemed to understand what Elena was attempting. He moved closer to her, positioning himself so that any military action would risk harming the human doctor who was trying to protect them. But his expression showed that he didn't expect her desperate gambit to succeed. "You risk much for strangers," the bear said softly, his voice carrying gratitude that transcended species boundaries. Elena looked into those intelligent eyes and knew that, regardless of what happened in the next few minutes, she was exactly where she needed to be. "You're not strangers," she said. "You're people, and people deserve protection." The bear's response would haunt Elena for the rest of her life. "If humans had more like you, there would be no need for war." As the military forces closed in around them, Elena realized she was standing at the epicenter of a conflict that would determine whether two intelligent species could find a way to coexist, or whether fear and misunderstanding would lead to the destruction of something remarkable and irreplaceable. The largest male bear made one final radio transmission, his voice carrying the weight of a leader making decisions that would affect the future of his entire people. Elena didn't understand the words, but she could hear the love and sacrifice in his voice as he prepared to make whatever stand was necessary to protect the families depending on him. The next few minutes would determine whether Elena's faith in the possibility of interspecies understanding was justified, or whether she would watch helplessly as fear destroyed the most remarkable discovery in human history. The helicopters hovered overhead, soldiers rappelling down with military precision, their weapons trained on the bears who stood in defensive formation around Elena and Dr. Chen. The tension was so thick it seemed to crackle in the air like electricity before a storm. Elena's heart pounded as she realized that history was about to be written in the next few moments, and the outcome would determine the fate of two intelligent species. Colonel Hayes himself descended from the lead helicopter, his authoritative presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone on the ground. His weathered face showed the experience of someone who had dealt with countless security situations, but Elena could see something different in his eyes when he looked at the bears, not just caution, but a flicker of uncertainty that suggested even he wasn't entirely sure how to handle this unprecedented scenario. "Dr. Vasquez," Colonel Hayes said, his voice carrying military authority but also an undertone of respect. "You're placing yourself in extreme danger. These animals have demonstrated coordinated resistance capabilities that pose a significant security threat." Elena remained positioned between the soldiers and the bear commander, her medical training overriding her survival instincts. "Colonel, with all due respect, these aren't animals. They're intelligent beings attempting to communicate. What you're planning isn't law enforcement, it's genocide." The word genocide seemed to hang in the air like an accusation that no one wanted to address. Elena watched as Colonel Hayes processed the implications of her statement, his military bearing wavering slightly as he considered the legal and moral complexities of the situation. The bear commander chose that moment to step forward, moving slowly to avoid triggering aggressive responses from the armed soldiers. When he spoke, his English was clearer than before, as if the urgency of the situation was forcing rapid improvement in his communication abilities. "Colonel Hayes," the bear said, his deep voice carrying across the clearing with startling clarity, "we have monitored your communications for many seasons. We know your name, your family, your service record. We do not wish conflict." The shock of being personally addressed by a wild animal nearly caused Colonel Hayes to stumble backward. Elena could see the trained soldier's worldview cracking as he faced undeniable proof of intelligence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. "You've been surveilling military personnel?" Colonel Hayes asked, his voice showing professional concern mixed with amazement. The bear's response was both reassuring and chilling. "We survey all who enter our territory. Knowledge is survival. But we have never harmed your people. We seek only to protect our families." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her scientific training finally overriding her fear of the military situation. "Colonel, I'm formally recommending that we halt all aggressive action until we can properly assess the full scope of what we're dealing with. The intelligence demonstrated here requires a completely different approach than standard wildlife management." Elena watched as Colonel Hayes struggled with a decision that would define his career and possibly change the course of human history. The military protocols were clear: neutralize the threat. But the evidence of genuine intelligence and peaceful intentions complicated those protocols in ways that no training manual had ever addressed. The bear commander seemed to sense the colonel's internal conflict. "We offer proof of peaceful intentions," he said, then made a complex vocalization that echoed through the forest. What happened next would be talked about in scientific circles for generations to come. From the trees around the clearing, bears began emerging, but they weren't taking defensive positions. Instead, they were carrying their young, approaching the armed humans in a display of trust that defied every survival instinct in the natural world. Elena gasped as she recognized the mother bear from the hospital among those approaching. Her 3 cubs nestled safely in her arms. The injured mother moved slowly but with dignity, her eyes fixed on Elena with unmistakable gratitude. The baby bottles Elena had helped prepare were still visible among the supplies the mother carried, evidence of the human compassion that had saved her children's lives. "They're showing us their babies," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face as she understood the magnitude of the gesture. In the animal kingdom, that's the ultimate sign of trust. They're proving they don't see us as threats by bringing their most vulnerable family members into the open. Colonel Hayes stared at the scene unfolding before him. Bears of all ages were emerging from concealment, forming a peaceful gathering that included grandparents, parents, and cubs. The social structure was complex and sophisticated, showing extended family bonds and community cooperation that rivaled human societies. One of the smallest cubs, barely old enough to walk, approached Elena with the fearless curiosity of the very young. The tiny animal reached up toward her with one small paw, making soft sounds that needed no translation. Elena knelt down and gently touched the cub's paw, feeling the warm life that pulsed within the small body. "Colonel," Elena said softly, "look at them. Really look at them. These aren't dangerous animals, they're families. Parents protecting their children, children learning from their elders, communities working together for survival. They're us, just in different forms." The bear commander spoke again, this time directing his words to all the humans present. "We have watched, your people, for 3 generations. We learned your language, from discarded books, from electronic devices, from listening to your children play in our forests. We never revealed ourselves because we feared what you do to things you do not understand." Dr. Chen's scientific mind was reeling with the implications. 3 generations of covert study, she breathed. They've been conducting their own anthropological research on us while we remained completely unaware of their intelligence. The bear continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "We know your music, your stories, your dreams. We have seen your kindness and your cruelty. We hoped, when we finally revealed ourselves, it would be to the kindness." Elena felt a sob catch in her throat as she realized the bears had been watching human society, learning about human nature and hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. They had revealed themselves not as conquerors or threats, but as hopeful neighbors seeking acceptance. Colonel Hayes lowered his weapon, and Elena saw the exact moment when the professional soldier made way for the human being. "Stand down," he commanded to his troops. "All weapons to safe positions. We are not dealing with a security threat." The relief that washed over the clearing was palpable. Bears and humans alike seemed to exhale tension that had been building toward an inevitable tragedy. But Elena knew this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation that humanity would need to have with itself. "What happens now?" Elena asked, looking between Colonel Hayes and Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen's response came with the excitement of someone witnessing history in the making. "Now we learn. We establish proper communication protocols. We study their society with their consent, and we figure out how 2 intelligent species can share this world peacefully." The bear's commander approached Elena one final time, moving with the dignity of a leader who had successfully protected his people through an impossible crisis. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a new beginning. You risked your life for strangers. You showed the kindness we hoped to find. Perhaps there is hope for both our peoples. Elena looked around at the gathering of two species that had found a way to step back from the brink of tragedy. The mother bear was bottle-feeding one of her cubs using techniques she had learned from watching Elena, while human soldiers were cautiously approaching other bear families with the wonder of children meeting new friends. 3 months later, Elena stood in the same clearing, but everything had changed. The space had been transformed into a joint research facility where humans and bears worked together to understand the mysteries of consciousness and communication. The injured mother bear, fully healed now, had become one of the primary liaisons between the species, her experience with human compassion making her a bridge between two worlds. The cubs Elena had helped save were thriving, growing strong under the care of both their bear family and the human researchers who had become their extended community. Dr. Chen's work had expanded from simple wildlife research to the establishment of entirely new fields of study focused on interspecies cooperation and communication. Elena watched as one of the cubs, now old enough to speak simple human words, played with a group of children from the nearby town. The sight of human and bear children learning together, sharing games and stories across species boundaries, filled Elena with hope for a future that would be richer for its diversity. Colonel Hayes, who had become an unexpected advocate for the bear community, approached Elena with news that would reshape the world. The United Nations has agreed to recognize the bears as a sovereign people, he said. It's unprecedented, but the evidence of their intelligence and peaceful intentions was impossible to ignore. Elena smiled as she watched the bear commander, who had chosen the human name David for ease of communication, teaching a group of human researchers about forest engineering techniques that could help combat climate change. The partnership between species was already producing benefits that neither could have achieved alone. As the sun set over the forest that had become a symbol of successful first contact, Elena reflected on the chain of events that had started with a desperate mother gathering baby supplies from a hospital. That single act of maternal love had led to the discovery that humans were not alone in their capacity for intelligence, compassion, and hope. The mother bear approached Elena as she often did during quiet moments, making the soft sound that had become their personal greeting. Elena reached out to touch the great animal's paw, feeling the warmth of a friendship that transcended the boundaries between species. "Thank you," Elena whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was thanking the bear for trusting her or thanking the universe for the chance to witness the birth of a new kind of world. The bear's response, spoken in English that had become fluent through months of practice, carried the wisdom of someone who understood that the best stories were just beginning. "Thank you for seeing people where others saw only animals. You helped us believe that dreams of peace could become reality." As darkness fell over the forest, Elena could hear the sounds of two species settling in for the night. Human laughter mixing with bear vocalizations, children of both kinds being told bedtime stories that now included tales of the day when fear gave way to understanding, and the world became larger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. The mother bear, who had gathered baby supplies from every ward, had done more than save her cubs. She had saved the possibility of a future where intelligence and compassion could flourish in forms that defied every expectation, reminding everyone who witnessed her story that love, in all its expressions, remained the most powerful force in any world.